Hello everyone. Welcome to MFOI's webinar titled Maximizing Your Municipal Performance Measurement Program. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Ed Archer, General Manager of Community and Corporate Services at the City of Barrie. Prior to joining the City of Barrie, Ed was a principal in public sector accounting with the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. His primary area of focus was the Public Sector Accounting Board's Performance Reporting Project. And Chris Van Doren, Program Lead, Performance Management at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, works directly with Ontario's municipal FIRs and the MPMP. Thank you both for joining us today, and let's get started. Over to you, Chris.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I woke up this morning because I had a presentation to do, and I put on a nice suit, and then as I got on the streetcar, I realized it's a webinar. You can't see me. Some of you, I expect, are getting ready to maybe have your lunch, so bon appetit. I looked at the list of participants in this webinar, and I was just amazed by the diversity of participants that we have in this session. There's a lot of interest, and having a conversation with you would be ideal, and I suspect and certainly hope that you'll have several questions that we can discuss and follow up on. In terms of the objective of our session, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the purpose and design of the Municipal Performance Measurement Program, and the big question around this is, why is it important to get the data right? The real focus of this webinar will be looking at a case study and how Barrie uses performance measurement data to manage its service delivery. Ed will be speaking a bit about that, and certainly he's the very credible experience to be able to address this in a very effective way. We really like to know your story, as I mentioned, and performance measures really about telling your story. And as a part of this, too, we do expect and hope to have future webinars around looking at specifically MPMP schedules, as well as a little more of a panel discussion on how to use data amongst different sizes and types of municipalities. So a bit about the program. Most of you would recall the 1990s and late 90s and in 2000 was a period of unprecedented change for local government, a lot of downloading, difference in responsibilities. And at that time, the province had this accountability and transparency directive too in terms of giving and working with municipalities and tools on reporting and measuring services. And this is the environment to which the MPMP program developed. Currently, there are 13 service areas, and the context of it is with the Municipal Act, which under Section 299 mandates municipalities report measures in these service areas, as well as reporting them publicly in a manner of their choosing. And that's very important to consider as well. Municipalities are going to understand and be able to best ascertain how to report these measures effectively. And it may not be only MP, it can be additional ones, and they will also have the opportunity to look at how to explain the differences and to create the narrative around their story and service delivery. Annually, the Minister writes a letter to all municipalities that you will see that goes to Heads of Council and also posted on our website. The question that is, how are the measures developed? We have expert panels through established professional associations and in organizations. For example, in roads and bridges, we work with the Ontario Roads Coalition through the Ontario Good Roads Association. Same with other SIMSA service areas. These measures then are vetted through a municipal advisory committee, which includes senior staff of municipalities and leaders of municipal associations. This includes AMCTO, AMO, and MFOA. The committee provides ongoing strategic advice to the program. These measures are based on readily available data and using standardized methodology, which is very important. The standardized methodology allows municipalities to communicate with each other. Municipalities report on the services they provide. So if it's an upper tier or lower tier, they would be looking at providing certain measures on specifically their services. And the focus on services and service levels, not just costs. Third, how is the data collected? The data collected through the financial information return and Excel workbooks. The important point is that numerators for all the cost efficiency measures, both total and operating, are automatically populated from expenses reported in the FIR Schedule 40. This is to say that significant parts of the schedules are already completed and there is no double entering of information. As such, you'll be finding that when you're completing your MPMP schedules, there is a lot of the information already there to help you assistance with that, including a check, program measurement check tabs, which assist in identifying needs to provide verification on some of the data provided or potential errors or completeness challenges you may face. All this information in terms of the instructions and the needing documents to help you and assist prepare those schedules are included on the FIR website, which the next slide provides a snapshot of. There are two important tabs that I'd like to illustrate: the FIR reporting, which contains all information needed to complete the MPMP schedules, and the view FIR data, which allows you to view data by schedules for individual municipalities or download for all municipalities by schedule. So all the data is contained on that site. The second important site for the program information is the Municipal Performance Measurement Program site. This contains the information about the annual Ministers-led Data Council for each reporting year, list of MPMP measures, optional templates for public reporting, and summary report of MPMP results for a group of municipalities. As mentioned earlier about providing information that not just service levels but also cost, the program reports both effectiveness and efficiency measures for operating total and operating costs and total costs. The next slide illustrates the process by which the data collection verification happens within the ministry. One point I want to emphasize is in this point about MPA reviews. Right now we're working with several municipalities to support them in improving the accuracy of the data and ensuring its completeness. Historically, however, and it continues to be, that is the municipality's responsibility to account for the information they provide. They are going to be able to defend and report that information. We're there to support you in that. One of the impetus of this session was a training we did last year on the analytical power of the financial information return municipal performance measurement program. And most of you, who attended that session, several would be on this webinar as well, spoke to the interest in understanding how to better complete schedules and better interpreting data. That was fairly consistent across all the different areas we spoke at or presented. What was a bit different was the question, what best describes my feeling about performance measuring? It varied amongst different regions and areas, and generally in most things we see that there are always a group who finds it quite difficult to understand or see value, and we want to work and support people to be able to demonstrate that there's value in this. Some of the feedback we received at the session included that this will get more beneficial as time goes. I see that I need to be accurate in my reporting. Another comment received was the session was an eye-opener on how easily a CFO could do comparisons and analysis. This is a case of a CFO looking at the service costs and working with council to demonstrate that they need to properly plan and account for some of their expenses and compare them with other municipalities. Another participant comment, it's important to start somewhere. I understand that figures are not perfect, but they can direct you to where you can find answers. We also received a response that I recognize the importance of good public reporting. We need to do a better job in communicating. Needless to say, there was some negative questions and understanding in terms of the value, but around conversation and getting us talking about these issues, you see there was tremendous value and appreciation for starting with some attempt at communicating how we provide our services in an effective and efficient manner. So a big question is, before we go forward, is why getting the data is right important to your municipality? First and foremost, the data is used by municipalities and provincial ministries. So if you're inundated, and I trust you are, with reporting and all that information, the more we can spend time and attention on the accuracy of this, the more others will be able to use it and save us time in actually requesting for more data. Academic communities and public at large have been showing more and more interest in the data. And the design of it as a management tool driven by municipalities is that you're taking ownership and using as best you can and trying creative ways, again, to create your story. Another important point is that the data is readily available and accessible. The information is available, the support's there, and it is based on ensuring that you are working with data that's available. So as we proceed and progress in terms of data availability, we can also enhance some of the measures. Another real important message, and this is what we'll talk a little bit with Ed's case and hopefully in future webinars, is that municipalities of various types and sizes have found ways to integrate performance measurements into operations. The MPMP for most of those serves as a starting point. It's not going to be the only means to find answers to your challenges, but it will help you in creating against that the reasons or looking further into the questions. And so moving forward, we want to consider examples, and the City of Barrie is one example of where they've used the data. Finally, in terms of contacts for further information, you'll see there's their FIR MPMP site that I spoke to. There is an email address if you have any questions. And I want to really thank all those municipalities for their continued efforts in ensuring reliable and accurate information is submitted. Several sites provide more information. We have the OMBI, Ontario Municipal Benchmarking Initiative, which goes much further in looking and focusing on peer-to-peer review and discussions. There's the Ontario Municipal Knowledge Networks, which has certainly in the past used a lot of the MPMP data as a starting point in identifying better practices. And there's the MIDAS AMOS Municipal Information Data Analysis System, which is a free tool that you can use, also run and look at comparatives or look at data provided in the FR and MPMP for your municipalities and others. So watch for future planned webinars on MPMP schedules and a panel of municipal practitioners on how they use MPM data. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it over to Ed.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ed Archer. I am the General Manager of Community and Corporate Services for the City of Barrie, and I've been with the City of Barrie for about 5.5 years. So you're going to listen to a description of Barrie's experience over that time that's evolved. So Barrie's experience with performance data is not new, but at the same time it's continuing to grow and it will develop further. There's a couple of messages that, notwithstanding the details and any discussion we might have following the presentation about the questions that are on your mind, that I'd like all of you to keep in mind. This works. It works if your objective is to have a council that can make a decision based on an understanding of the relationship between the services they're providing and the costs that are required to produce them. There are two principles that we use in Barrie implicitly in all of our approaches to decision making that underlie the effectiveness of the messages and the insights that I'm going to share with you. The first is that one, services drive costs. We can't talk about services or costs in isolation. One has an effect on the other. As managers, it's our job to understand what that relationship is. So what performance information you choose to use and how you decide to use it influences the level of political decision making and the type of political decision making that goes on in your community. That's an area where you have significant influence. Whether you're an analyst with hands on the data or whether you are, like me, a member of the senior leadership team responsible for giving council advice and acting on the directions that council provides, you have significant influence over the shape and the form of that discussion. The other principle we follow is we use data to drive decision making. So there are always opportunities for politicians to take our advice and decide to do something else. That's their call, and that's the job they play. Their responsibility is to be accountable for their decisions. Our job is to give them the best possible advice. So again, regardless of the level of the organization in which you serve today, the data that we develop is the data we should be using for decision making. What councils do with it, what the public does with it, is a bit of a separate issue and not completely within our control. But it is important to demonstrate from an accountability perspective and from the perspective of building trust among those who have given us the responsibility to manage resources that we are using data to drive decision making. So again, I'll say service levels are driven and are driving costs, and data being used for decision making are two principles that apply in any size organization that's trying to use better non-financial data for decision making. So what I want to show with you is some insights about Barrie's experience. We use a lot of performance information in a lot of different ways throughout all of our programs and services. And they do have an impact on the choices council makes about program funding and service delivery. It's important to portray the information in the right context. Context matters. But I would say that after 5.5 years, Barrie's experience with performance reporting and using performance data has influenced the type of political decision-making that happens and the type of community reaction to local government services that exist. Barrie is a pretty typical community, as I'll show you in the next couple of slides, where we are average in many ways. And as far as local governments go, we are probably not that different from many in the province. We have just over 700 permanent employees. We are a single-tier jurisdiction. As you can see on the chart here, there are a number of unionized and non-union staff. We have firefighters and part-time employees. We also have police staff and are managed by a police services board. Our social services, the social housing and Ontario Works, are delivered by the County of Simcoe through a partnership arrangement. We have a number of part-time staff as well. They're not in this count, but when you count them, we have 1,100 employees on the payroll each year. And we're structured this way. So where you see on the chart here the box that highlights my role, I'm a member of the executive team, and we have each department led by a director who is part of our senior leadership team. So a relatively small group of folks with responsibility for guiding the organization in a way that achieves council's objectives. Our job is to give council the best advice we can, and their job, which is tougher in my opinion, is to make the decisions about how to proceed and develop the organization's programs and services. It's not an easy job, and probably like in your community, and whether you're a police service or whether you're a service that's delivering local government services like Barrie, you are dealing with funding challenges, pressures on all of our funding sources to deliver programs and services that require typically more resources each year than they've had in previous years, yet the constraints are there. Affordability is a legitimate concern, and councillors are acutely aware of the limitations that taxpayers need to consider when making choices about how much spending their local government should provide for the services that are being delivered. So our tax bill gets split up probably, again, typically like most municipalities' tax bills. We are about half the total bill collected, and for that we deliver about 60 programs and services. And I'll talk to you a little bit more later in the presentation about how that looks. But what we've done is, through some additional coding information in our operating budget, we've categorized all of our expenditures into service buckets. So we can describe the spending that we do across the organization for roads and recreation programs and other services that are recognizable to someone who's not got a financial background or who's not a particularly a knowledgeable person about how municipal government works. Like most jurisdictions, I imagine, most of our money comes from the property taxpayer. We consistently, although we have a policy that calls for us to earn more of our revenues from non-tax sources, so user fees and charges, end up each year with about 7% of our total revenues coming from those fees and charges. So the taxpayer has a significant influence over political decision-making in our community, and there are regularly and on an annual basis debates about how much taxes are appropriate for each taxpayer to pay. So to help us manage that, we use a fairly structured process of business planning. And if you look at Barrie's website and look through the business plan section of that site, you'll see annually our budget, which we call a business plan, illustrates our approach to using this continuous management cycle that you see on the screen. Council is responsible for strategic planning. And in our community, Council has actually published a strategic plan. My opinion is it's not necessary to have a published strategic plan. Council still is responsible for setting the strategy. Our council has chosen to articulate that clearly in a document that is in fact broadcast throughout the organization in all of our facilities using message boards and posters that illustrate what their strategic priorities are and the actions they expect to take throughout their term to achieve those outcomes. And that's where annual planning comes in. And that's really the handshake between Council's desired outcomes and our ability as staff to put resources to work to execute plans that will bring those outcomes to life. That's our budget process. And I'll talk in some more detail about the work plan and the budget documents and the individual performance agreements that are tied to that planning process. But it's all premised on the idea that services drive our costs and that there is a set of data required for us to make our decisions. And so throughout the year, we measure our performance. We use a balanced scorecard format, and we as management teams get regular updates from our staff about the performance data that we've chosen to measure our programs with. And that's typically internally reported We report it to council through the business planning process. It's an actual binder, and again on our website you can see the form of reporting we use to talk publicly about this information. But it is something that we publicly discuss, and that to us is important. It's important because it strengthens the credibility of the discussion we have with council about the spending requirements we're managing, and it helps enhance understanding. Councillors are looking for details that help them explain in a simple way to residents who may object, or who may think that object to taxes being raised, or who may think that taxes may need to be applied in a different way, why the approaches we're taking are the ones council chooses. Performance data helps them tell their story in a simple way. So whatever the data you choose, at some point there's a public discussion you're going to have with it, and councillors need to understand it and be able to talk on their own to interested residents using the information to make this cycle work as effectively as it can. And we have that to some degree in Barrie, and in many cases our councillors, there are 11 of them including the mayor, well understand the value of this information, and they use it regularly in discussions with their constituents. So how can performance data influence decisions about service levels? Certainly spending levels matter, but if all you do is focus on spending, you will create disconnects between expectations for results and your capacity to deliver them. So in dialogue with councillors, our public discussions during the business planning process are designed to show how each of our departments uses the resources that it has responsibility for, and for describing the extent to which the goals and objectives that it has will be achieved that period, and at what cost. And that last part, the at what cost component, is really the intersection of the non-financial performance and financial performance information that Barrie has successfully developed. Most municipalities, I imagine, have publications that describe the great things that have been accomplished in the year, and every municipality has financial reports that shows where resources were applied through revenue and expenditure reports. But we've created connections between those two types of data that brings the discussion to a different level and turns it into something more substantial. So whether it's a senior leadership team conversation about recommendations to council regarding where limited dollars should go, or whether it's a political discussion in a public session of council about the service levels we're providing and the need to change those somehow to reflect public expectations, we have, through this approach, managed to create a bridge that lets everyone understand that when you change a service level, there is automatically a change in cost, whether that's up or down. There will be a relationship to the level of spending that you incur, unless you want to go through an exercise of reviewing the approach to service delivery, a performance review, a service review, that would be designed to re-engineer the process to produce greater levels of efficiency. And Barrie has done that as well. I'll talk briefly about that in a little while. So all of this underlines some fairly simple concepts that work if you put the effort into making them work. This is important because you can't get the full story of what a local government is designed to do by looking only at the financial information. You need a multidimensional perspective. And that perspective isn't something that is coming from the opinion of someone who's worked in municipal government for a long time. This is what research and ad hoc feedback and feedback from politicians will tell you is required for them to be able to do their job well. People aren't interested in how hard we're trying. People are interested in the results that we get. This is about managing people's quality of life. This is about ensuring that the water is available when they turn on the tap. This is about ensuring that their drive to work is as pain-free and efficient as possible, and that the roads are in good shape. This is about ensuring that their kids have recreation programs and that leisure opportunities and an overall appearance of the community is managed in a way that makes them feel good about the taxes that they do pay, and they recognize that they're getting value for money. So we can't stick to one-dimensional financial reporting. It's just insufficient for dealing with the kinds of policy issues that local governments have today that are driven by constituent expectations. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on results and not just inputs. So most jurisdictions, most services would have operating budgets that at a minimum look at controlling levels of funds. And so the level of detail in your budget and the type of information that you discreetly manage in those operating budgets always focus on control. That's an important responsibility that we have. And what's different about Barrie's approach is moving towards managing services. So yes, we're still interested in controlling funds, of course, but we're also interested in telling the story of how we're going to turn those resources into the programs and services that people have come to expect. And so for that, we need information about the processes we're using, and that allows us to produce indicators that we report in our balanced scorecard. So efficiency information based on units of output, and quality information based on any number of things: the pavement condition, the level of satisfaction of a program or a service, the participation rate that we get from a recreation program, various elements to describe not just where spending went, but what the results were from the spending. So what Barrie has done is built a process that we follow annually for our business planning that starts with a work plan. Again, looking at those departments that I talked about, taking the opportunity and using something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. What we've defined for each of our departments are all the processes, the continuous routine services that we provide, and all the projects, the one-time things that have a start and a stop to them for the year, and identify where we anticipate staff time will go, because staff time is typically a significant driver of our costs. And then we've applied the financial information to those details, and that gives us a department work plan. And what we've then been able to do is, through that additional coding that I referenced in our budget, develop some reports that show council the costs of the programs and services that we anticipate delivering. And it also shows us that for the levels of service that we anticipate having to provide, whether there are any gaps. And if there are gaps, what we have then is a risk of either not meeting expectations or a risk of trying to do too much with too few resources, or an opportunity for a discussion, which is an opportunity that we take to talk to council about changing the level of resources to suit the service level that we're trying to produce. And so each of these department services are further categorized into a list of roughly a dozen what we call enterprise services. These are really big picture looks at the service levels and the services that we're providing and the costs related to doing that. It is a basis for discussion that council can understand. And the exercise in putting it together is really not that complicated. Council doesn't see the information in the workflow here. They see the results of it at a very summarized level. But there's a level of judgment that directors are responsible for that defines the processes that their group is responsible for managing. And then they also identify the projects that they're going to take on for that year. And that comes from any number of sources. That comes from requests that they have received either from the public or from other departments. That comes from the direction that they're getting from council strategic plan. And that together reduces the availability of staff time and leads to choices about which projects are going to be prioritized and how much of the process flow requirements are going to be addressed. And so we can change the cycle time of a process, for example, to make the resources available fit the service level that we're delivering by changing a service level, or we can add more resources. Third thing we could do is redesign the process. And so if you have a 45-day window for paying your accounts payable, but your resource availability tells you through this exercise that you're only going to be able to do that 30% of the time, you could decide to change your policy regarding how long it takes you to pay bills. You could redesign the process and make sure that you've got a more efficient workflow than the one you have now and stay within your 45-day window. Or you could add more resources to that process and put the 45-day payment cycle in a greater likelihood of being achieved. Those details, that kind of choice, comes from the exercise that's described in this picture. When you get that information, you get a bunch of performance data. And what Barrie's been able to do is make some comparisons to show councillors where we have some extra risk or where we have opportunities for improving the efficiency of our programs and services. This is really a signal to us to look a little closer at some programs and direct our limited resources to where they have the opportunity to make the biggest difference. So a picture like what you see here would suggest to a politician or to a senior manager that our water service is one that could perhaps, through additional review, produce some efficiency opportunities that could reduce cost. Whereas with respect to parking, what you see is that we don't have a cost problem there, we have a service level problem. And that's what the effectiveness indicator suggests. And so I can tell you, just for context, in Barrie, we have about 50% of the average revenues per parking space than almost any other community in the province. Yet we have a similar cost structure to you in delivering that service. It's supposed to be self-funding. It isn't. So our challenge is to decide what level of service should we be providing and then manage ourselves in accordance with the policy of keeping the funds at the same level as the resources required and the costs required to produce the service. This type of information can be presented in a number of different ways, and what you see here is an example of a service presentation that Council looked at and wondered about the opportunity to create some further service efficiencies and changes in service level through a budget process. What this showed was that compared to some peers, we identified areas in our IT, water, wastewater, and fire services areas as being less efficient than average, and that's a very broad generalization. Similarly, we identified that our parking service, our leisure and recreation, our clerks and parks areas are delivering a higher service level than average. And so for councillors who are interested in managing overall spending, there may be opportunities to improve the efficiency of some programs on the left side of this picture, or changing the service level of the services that are on the top right corner, and still manage resident expectations. So that's what they did. They asked us to look through our 2011 process at 6 program areas before we spent any additional funds on those to address opportunities that would produce tangible results in 2012's budget that reduce their overall net costs. And that took us, as you'll see, about 6 months to complete. We had 3 objectives. We wanted to make sure that we looked at the program's scope and expectations for results against a peer group, and performance data was the basis for that comparison. In some cases, we used consultants to help us manage this analysis, and their experience played a role in that comparison as well. From that, what we had were options for change, options. It was still management's choice as to which of those options we took, but the opportunity to compare data really created some shortcuts for us to focus in on those other jurisdictions that looked like they were doing something different, and gave us a chance to hone in faster on evaluating opportunities that we could apply somehow in Barrie. And that resulted in recommendations to the management team that then led their way into the 2012 business plan. So we needed to consider something that was practical. We didn't want a series of recommendations that took years to implement. We didn't want recommendations that were going to be virtually impossible to produce because of either service expectations that existed or because of the legislative requirements that we might have to meet for some of those services. So we really worked hard with the consultant teams, and in the cases of where staff teams were delivering these reviews, worked hard at making sure we had practical options for change. And where other organizations offered a model, we made sure we studied those and evaluated the way they were doing business to see if we could adapt it for use in Barrie. And because of the expectations for this to make a budget impact in the following year, we also needed to look at how long it would take to produce those results. So overall, we spent about 6 months doing this work. Council gave us this direction to conduct these reviews in April. In May, the executive team and the related program managers for those ones that were being reviewed developed terms of reference together, and we issued requests for proposals in most of the cases. By July, we had consultants selected, and through the rest of the year, we worked with them on the analysis and the reports. In January, we showed Council a budget that included the recommendations for change that would make their net cost reduction objective come to fruition. Practically, what we ended up with were changes that would occur over multiple periods, so many years in our case. But for the next year, that is 2012, we produced, as expected, about $700,000 in reduction opportunities, spending reduction, not necessarily service level reduction, because there were some efficiencies that were discovered. But with that, $700,000 in the context of Barrie's budget is just under 0.5% of a tax increase. And that was exactly what councillors were looking for. They recognized that some work would be required to make some of the changes happen and that some longer terms would be needed for some of the larger impacts to be created. But because we could show them with this data what the relationship between spending changes were and the service impacts, they gave us the green light to proceed without much debate and with very strong support. And as a vehicle for explaining to those residents who think we may not be spending as efficiently as we actually are, this was information they could use to show the public, just like we did, that we have strong control over the resources that we're responsible for using, and that the results we're getting are the results we say we're going to get. So this has developed into a larger dialogue, both with council and among the staff team, about the relationship between spending and costs over all of our programs and services. I'm sure, just like many of you, the spending pressures that we had to deal with last year are only being exacerbated in 2013, and looking ahead at 2014 will continue to be difficult challenges that we need to manage. This type of approach helps us manage them. Because what it does is it enhances our understanding of how the service levels we're providing influence our spending decisions. That leads to discussions about longer-term perspectives and making sure that you don't make commitments today that create costs over the very long term. So Barrie, from deciding to use those two principles of services driving costs and using data for decision-making, now has not only this robust framework of reporting annual business planning expectations, it's also got a very robust perspective on its long-term financial planning. The tools we need to use to develop that long-term financial plan are still under development. But the idea that we have to look at the long term is generally accepted, and councillors are routinely now, after 5 years, aware that a decision they take today to issue debt, for example, or to increase a level of service has consequences beyond simply this reporting period. That's led to a discussion about some of the things that drive costs that are kind of invisible. So the quality of the infrastructure that we're managing. And we have an asset management group that has done fantastic work on life cycle management activities. And that's influenced council's discussions about the value of replacing assets versus spending on maintenance. And we've had great success at helping them recognize the value of spending at appropriate times on asset renewal and replacement that then creates a longer life for that asset and avoids the need to replace it before it's reached its natural end. So they understand the consequences that are associated with changing service levels or changing fees in the program. And that's come about as a result of now several years of working with this information and turning their attention away from just a discussion about cost to a discussion about service. And whether you're responsible for managing simply a set of roads in a relatively small community, or whether you're responsible for delivering, like Barrie, a robust package of services to a community that has multiple needs, this is a type of discussion that everybody is really well positioned using this information to have, and frankly, in my opinion, needs to have. Because the types of challenges that local governments have are not going to be significantly different in the coming years. The sustainability of our programs and services, the levels of debt we manage, the levels of spending that we ask council to consider are going to be significant challenges for those councils for years to come. What we've been able to successfully do in Barrie that I think others using a similar approach could also achieve are decisions about spending that just wouldn't have been taken 5 years ago. Thanks to the capital asset condition information we have, there's now a charge in our budget to build reserves to support asset renewal and replacement down the road. So council recognizes that residents today are using up those assets. They will eventually need to be replaced, and they then are going to put money away to a greater degree than we have in the past to fund their replacements. That's going to reduce our reliance on debt financing. They think longer and harder about types of discounts they apply or the fee waivers that they give to different groups, because they recognize that the funds that we're giving up in those cases then go back to the taxpayer. And that's something that they're much more sensitive about, that we've been able to show them this connection between services and costs than they were 5 years ago. So we end up developing stronger strategies, and our approach to asset management is just an example of how, using this type of information, we then manage at a different level, and the expectations we put on ourselves grow so that we match the expectations the community has for levels of service in a more consistent and reliable way. So as an organization, I've talked throughout this presentation about the services and the processes and projects that we deliver and the relationship they have to council's discussions. This is from our business plan. It's the list of the services that we deliver at a departmental level and then at an enterprise level. So the groupings of department services roll up into reports that describe those enterprise services. What council sees is a list like this. As a result, with the performance information that we show them and the balance of the financial information that makes up our budget, they get an opportunity to look at these services and identify where they would like to see those types of service reviews that I talked about be undertaken, to see where the opportunities for efficiency or service level changes really are. Not all of these services really cost that much money. There are a few that cost relatively small dollars. They can have a big impact nonetheless. And so over the last 3 years, we've covered, through the approach of reporting this information publicly and discussing the issues that related to service delivery that exist in each of them with council, reviews that council has directed us to undertake that address most of our spending and almost a third of the services you see here. So when we talk to council about having limitations on our ability to continue doing more with less, for example, a common expression that politicians like to use, our council understands, thanks to this information, that we've really beaten the bushes and looked through in great detail at the services and the way we're delivering them to make sure that they are as efficient as they can be for the levels of service council has identified as being important for Barrie. It's worked very well, and I think as a result, the discussion is different. And that's the point. The data is nice and it's important, but it's not really about the data. It's about the discussion you have. You've got better opportunities for more effective communication between council and staff and between council and the community when you have this type of information. And when you use it routinely, then you're building trust. You're building trust among your leadership team that you understand the issues everyone's managing. As well, you focus council's attention more on strategy and policy than it might otherwise. And that's really important because their role is to set the direction and to make sure we've got the right policies in place. So from my perspective, this is an approach that works universally, regardless of the size of the community that you're serving, regardless of the types of services that you're responsible for providing. It is about changing the type of discussion you have with your politicians. It is about changing the way we look at the way we manage our programs and services, because it's data that informs, but it doesn't replace our judgment. It builds our capacity to deal with the issues that we've got. And those types of reviews that Barrie has undertaken really concretely establish a solid understanding of the relationship between costs and service levels and quality. And what that reveals, unsurprisingly probably, is that we often need to change or strengthen some of the policies that we're following. In some cases, they're simply good practice that have evolved over many years. But as long as we codify those and make sure that everyone understands and agrees that those policies and those practices are policies that we should follow, then we are in a good position to manage going forward. And process documentation typically isn't something that municipalities have spent a lot of time on in the past. So as we approach a phase of our existence where a lot of retirements are going to be happening, getting that documentation in place is really important. Those people are going to be leaving with a lot of corporate knowledge, and in the absence of that documentation could be creating opportunities for us to let people down by not having those service levels provided in a consistent way. Reviews like the ones Barrie have undertaken help highlight the importance of that kind of investment in time and effort to avoid greater costs down the road. So what you end up with, if you take this kind of approach, is a common language and an understanding that's shared by every level of the organization of the key issues that you're managing. And generally you get more strategic thinking that is deeper and happens across the organization. And when there are service interruptions, when there are challenges to the service level that you're managing, you've got an increased capacity to respond because this information is available. Whereas if you didn't have it, you'd be subject to a lot of judgments and opinion that wouldn't necessarily reflect the reality that you're managing. So Barrie's evolved, and it will continue evolving. But as an example of how this information comes into play in the MPMP data, because of its scope and because of its relative high level, the relative simplicity of assembling it, provides a basis for others to follow this kind of approach. Lets us move away from the perspective that some politicians and some historically have had of local government services, where we've basically asked people to trust us that we're doing the job that we've been charged with, and we're working really hard, so that's important. And to showing more on the evidence side that we have, in fact, a solid understanding of our business, and that we've got a basis for establishing the resources that we need to provide the levels of service that the community is looking for. If you do this, what you end up with is a great collaboration with your council, better management, and as a result, better decisions. And all of that leads to greater public trust and confidence, which in my opinion, if you've got that, then discussions about tax increases, discussions about new staff, discussions about new equipment become a lot easier to have, because the initial resistance to avoiding spending in the public sector is replaced with a discussion about whether there's opportunities to change the approach to service or whether there's an opportunity to change the service level. But no one would then be in the same position to debate whether the spending decision is the right one. The focus is on the service. So with that, I've described generally Barrie's experience. I would turn it back over to you, and you can deal with any questions that you've got.
And I have a question for you. If we look at the participants in this webinar, and we see such a range of municipalities, the MPMP program is designed, as you mentioned as well. There's high level. It's fairly simple in terms of what you're looking at and in terms of how you prepare it. Now, for those municipalities that, say, don't have the capacity that Barrie has, how do you speak to them? How can they start using some of the data that they collect in the MPMP to look at their services and create their story around performance?
I would say a couple things. First, accept and live the principles that I talked about. There's two of them. Services drive costs, and you use data for decision making. If you've got those in place, then what you need is a senior manager, someone at a senior level of the organization, to commit to following them. Then all you need are really an Excel spreadsheet and someone who knows how to use it. So you need someone with a financial background and that can, using your direction or a senior manager's direction, identify the indicators that would be relevant for decision making. Starting and experimenting with that information is really important. So I think regardless of the size of the community, you don't need a big infrastructure to do this stuff. This is good management. And I would say getting started and committing to following those principles will go a long way.
What are the top 5 measurements that you would focus on due to time?
My opinion is you need a mix of both efficiency and quality information. So looking at top 5, I think it's a judgment call based on the scope of your programs and services. But looking at the MPMP indicators would be a good place to identify those that would be most important to you. If you're interested in sharing a discussion with council about your community's overall financial condition, then I would point you to PSAB's guidance on the indicators of financial condition that it recommends as a statement of recommended practice. That's something Barrie also uses, and the indicators that it describes there have been very effective at helping council understand the choices they need to make regarding taking on more debt or waiting a while to be able to afford some of the asset renewal or spending decisions that they'd like to undertake. But my opinion would be you need a mix of efficiency and quality indicators, and a good place to identify those as a start is the MPMP list.
Thank you, Ed. We have another question from Steve Babcock. Can you speak to some of the challenges that you faced during the transition from a typical department-based budget model to the service-based budget model?
Yes, the big challenge was having available information at our fingertips. There were program staff who just weren't used to tracking information in a way that would make these indicators easily come together. There was a learning curve. What we did to address that was start with the perspective that the executive team, first of all, bought into this approach without reservation, so they knew there was executive support for it. And I, as the sponsor, led the development of some training that we gave everybody who had responsibility for touching any part of the budget, and then an expectation that those department heads would identify indicators that they would be responsible for producing in their scorecards. So this exercise took about 3 months. Again, we've got about 20 departments and 60 programs and services. So over the course of 3 months, we went from having really very scattered and limited data to a robust set of information for the entire corporation's programs and services. That was probably the biggest challenge, and we overcame that through training. We overcame that through making department heads identify first what the indicators they thought would be useful for them looked like. And then, given my background, I helped shape some of their initial suggestions into indicators that council would be interested in seeing as well. The comparison was always, and the starting point for some of them was, things like the MPMP list, since we're already reporting that, and Barrie participates in the Intermunicipal Benchmarking Initiative, so there's a catalog of data that OMBI anticipates will provide, and that was another source of information for them as well.
Thank you, Ed. Question from Jacqueline, and I think this is more directed towards Chris. Is the province going to make additional efforts to provide standardized and clear definitions for what's included in each category to ensure we are comparing like information?
Thanks for the question. This is often the challenge we face, and the fact that there are different ways we can account for costs, and the idea of creating standardized measures is to create a means by which municipalities can talk to each other about some of the costs and services they provide. Now, in terms of working with definitions and clarity, it is an ongoing work in progress, and this is why we've set up such a structure that allows those from particular service areas, professionals and so forth to be involved with that. But it also requires continued conversation, and you're not going to have a perfect measure, but you're hopefully, in terms of identifying some of your costs and noting that they're different than those who you looked at as comparable municipalities, you can start to have a conversation around that. So the province is certainly working to provide more support around enhancing those, but also it requires a real effort on all of us to help make us work to focus on consistency in how we report that information.
Thank you, Chris. And we've got a question from Jennifer. How did you come to decide that 4% was the goal to achieve?
We chose 4% because another source for some financial information is the annual study that BMA Consulting produces that compares statistics for about usually 90 or so municipalities. So most of us participate in the annual BMA study. And that comparison includes the affordability indicators that we use in Barrie. So 4% was the average at the time we set the policy, and we were at about 3.5%. So 4% was based on a judgment that the average was reasonable. Barrie is, in many ways, as I said at the start of the conversation, average. But it was ultimately Council's agreement with that number that kind of put it in place. But the source of the comparison was BMA's municipal study.
Thank you, Ed. And Chris, could you please cite the detailed instructions for every measures which is posted on the FIR homepage?
If you just Google financial information return, you'll get a site that comes up. It's the FIR site, includes also the MPMP information. And as you scroll down there, you'll be able to see the instructions to how to fill out the schedules. That's the same site that contains all the data. If I'm not answering your question, please follow up with me offline. My email address is simply my name, chris.vandorn@ontario.ca, but you also, if looked at the introductory comments I provided, it included a site, a help email address that you can send any questions to as well.
Thank you for that, Chris. And it looks like we don't, oh, we just got another question in. I have a comment that, from Heidi. I have a comment that I agree we need clearer standards. We've done detailed comparisons of schedules with another similar municipality and found material differences in how items were categorized in 80% of the lines, i.e. Schedule 40. The allocation of program support is another major issue. We are having a hard time trusting the comparability of the efficiency data on MPMP. PSAB rules of treatments of capital items has also caused major distortions, i.e. material maintenance items that were previously capital but are now operating.
This is a common challenge that we face, and I think that if we again start looking at our own services and comparing ourselves and look at what's possible there, we do need to spend more attention on, I think you've mentioned Schedule 40, it's the FIR, the Schedule of Expenditures. We see that in terms of even how people count for indirect costs, there's some means that we need to have conversation around ensuring that there's more consistency. We acknowledge these are issues and work in progress, but again, to just look at your own municipality, and as you start seeing that there are differences, maybe you focus on certain service areas and have conversations around those. Ed, did you have anything to add to this?
If I could add, I would say that the challenges of comparability involve policy choices that each of us as municipalities can make, and then we're legitimately well positioned to choose different approaches for recording information based on our understanding of what our local needs are. It does make initial comparisons a little more difficult. What the data that the MPMP comparisons offer are an opportunity to identify just where outliers are. And if there are continued problems with consistency or comparability, what Barrie has done by joining OMBI is go through a process with a group of municipalities that's decided to be a little more rigorous and focused on making sure that we've weeded out some of those definition differences and make the consistency happen up front. But what that is a shortcut to the kind of analysis that you need. And so Chris's suggestion of using your own trend data as a basis for comparison would reduce the risk of having inconsistencies. But it would also be a good idea to consider approaching some of those that you regularly want to compare with and seeing if you could at least understand the policy differences or eliminate them in the type of reporting that you do to get to the issues that you're really interested in, and that is how can you adapt better practices for your own jurisdiction.
All right, thank you for that, Chris and Ed. And it looks like we don't have any more questions. I'd like to thank you all for joining us in today's webinar, and we appreciate your feedback and ask that you take a few minutes to complete the survey that we will be sending to you at the end of this broadcast. Thank you all, and bye for now.